Last Tuesday, I was handed a document inside Westminster that I was not supposed to see. Not classified. Not stolen. Just. Not meant for my eyes. It was an internal briefing. 2 pages. And the number at the top of the second page stopped me cold. 47%. That is the proportion of Labour MPs who, according to the party's own internal polling, now believe Keir Starmer will not lead them into the next general election. Not opposition MPs. Not Reform. Not the press. Labour's own people. Nearly half of the parliamentary party has privately concluded that the man they put into Downing Street less than 2 years ago is already done. I stood in that corridor and read it twice. Then I put it down and walked to the chamber for PMQs. And I watched Starmer stand at the dispatch box, composed, controlled, the careful lawyer's face giving nothing away, and answer questions about the boats, about the NHS, about the cost of living, with the smooth deflections of a man who still believes the story can be managed. It cannot. And somewhere in that building, 47% of his own people already know it. What follows is what I know, what I have seen, and what Britain needs to hear before the managed version of this collapse becomes the only version anyone is allowed to tell. Subscribe. Because this channel exists for exactly this kind of conversation, the honest one. The one that does not get managed or softened before it reaches you. Let me start somewhere unexpected. Not with the polls, not with the boat numbers. We will get there. But with a moment that happened in the tea room about 6 weeks ago that has stayed with me ever since. A Labour backbencher. Someone elected in 2024 on the wave. Someone who had genuinely believed in what they were doing, sat down across from me with a cup of tea going cold in front of them and said, not angrily, just tiredly, that they had stopped defending the immigration record on the doorstep. Not because they had been told to stop, because they physically could not find the words anymore. The numbers had taken the words away. I have thought about that a lot, because that is not a rebel. That is not someone with an axe to grind or a leadership ambition sharpening into view. That is someone who went into politics because they believed things could be better and has found themselves in a government that is making them worse, and who cannot find a way to square that circle that they can say out loud to their own constituents. When that is happening in the tea room, when the people who are supposed to be the true believers have gone quiet, the reckoning is not coming. It has already arrived. So let us talk about the numbers, because they do tell a story that words sometimes struggle to carry.
Like Labour, always Labour, and but not anymore now.
Do you feel sort of betrayed by the Labour Party? I do.
I don't like Starmer, I don't like what he's done.
75% of the British public view this Prime Minister unfavourably. Sit with that for a second, because it is genuinely extraordinary. That is not a bad patch. That is not the normal ebb and flow of midterm unpopularity that every government experiences. YouGov had his net favourability at -57 earlier this year, even with some slight movement since it sits around -45 to -48. For context, the only comparable figure in modern British political history belongs to Liz Truss. During the 45 days that ended with the pound in freefall and her resignation, Starmer has been in office for nearly 2 years, and he has achieved the remarkable distinction of being less popular than a prime minister whose entire tenure lasted about as long as a school term. But here is the thing about numbers. They are lagging indicators. By the time the polls show you this, the reality has usually been established for quite a while. The numbers are not the cause of the reckoning. They are the confirmation of it. The reckoning started the moment the first boats crossed after the election, when the first waiting list data came in after the budget, when the first business owner said, not to a journalist, just to a friend, at a kitchen table, that the national insurance increase was going to cost him 2 members of staff. That is when it started. The polls just finally caught up. Now, channel crossings. I know some people are tired of hearing about this issue. I understand that. But I'm going to ask you to stay with me on it for a moment, because the reason it matters is not purely about immigration policy. It is about something more fundamental than that. Since Labour took office, over 65,000 people have crossed the channel illegally. In 2025 alone, more than 41,000 arrivals. a 13% increase on the previous year, the second highest annual total ever recorded. On some individual days in 2026, over 300 people crossed in a single 24-hour period. And here is what I want you to focus on. Not just those figures, but what happened at Prime Minister's questions when Nigel Farage put them directly to Starmer in the chamber. I was there. I watched it. Farage read the numbers out, slowly, clearly. And Starmer, the man who in 2024 stood before the country and said he would smash the smuggling gangs, stop the boats, make this the defining domestic achievement of his government, changed the subject, just turned the wheel and drove somewhere else entirely. Every Reform MP stood up and walked out. Not dramatically, not with theatrics. They just stood and left. Because when a Prime Minister responds to the central failure of his central promise by pretending the question was about something else, the only honest response is to refuse to participate in the pretense. I have been in that chamber for enough of these exchanges now to recognize the difference between a government that is managing a problem and a government that has run out of ways to discuss one. What I saw that day was the second thing. The cost of it all is something that does not get talked about in terms that connect to people's actual lives. So let me try to do that now. £8 million. Every single day. That is what British taxpayers are currently spending to house people who crossed illegally in hotels and converted accommodation. Not £8 million total, per day. That is nearly £3 billion a year. £3 billion that could be going into GP surgeries or hospital wards or the social care system that is quietly collapsing in county after county while the government talks about long-term reform and commissions more reviews. I spoke recently to a practice manager at a GP surgery in the East Midlands. Not a politician, not an activist. Someone who has spent 20 years trying to make a difficult system work for the people who depend on it. She told me the wait for a routine appointment in her area is now running at 3 to 4 weeks. She told me that the system is not broken in a way that is fixable with the current level of resource and the current level of demand. She was not angry. She was just describing a reality. That reality and the £3 billion exist simultaneously. And the people who made the choice that produced both of those things at the same time are asking for patience from the very families bearing the cost of it. That is not sustainable, not politically and not morally. There is another dimension to this that I think has been underreported, and it concerns what is happening inside the Labour Party itself. Anas Sarwar, the leader of Scottish Labour, a senior figure, not a backbench dissenter, publicly said it was time for Starmer to go. That is not a small thing. That is the leader of a devolved Labour administration breaking cover and saying openly what has been whispered in Westminster for months. When that happens, when it stops being a private conversation and becomes a public statement from someone at that level, it usually means the private conversation has reached a volume that can no longer be contained. Starmer's response was to say that removing him would plunge Britain into instability. And I want to gently point out the problem with that response. The instability is already here. It is in the polls. It is in the boats. It is in the energy costs rising again as the situation with Iran feeds through to fuel prices. It is in the tea room conversations where the true believers have gone quiet. Claiming that your departure would cause instability when you are already presiding over it is not a defense. It is a description. There is a comparison I keep coming back to, and it is an imperfect one, but it has something in it worth examining. Tony Blair's later years. The damage of Iraq, the fuel protests of 2000 that paralysed the country, the gradual erosion of the authority that came with the 1997 landslide. Blair went through all of that. And even at his lowest, he had two things that Starmer does not have. He had genuine personal charisma, the ability to walk into a room and make people feel that whatever they thought of the policy, the person at least believed in something. And he had the afterglow of early success, things that had genuinely been delivered in those first terms that people could point to, even when they were angry. Starmer has neither of those reserves. There is no early success to point to. There is no personal warmth that transcends the policy failures. And he is facing his crisis not at the end of a long, successful run, but at the very beginning, before the goodwill bank was ever really filled. That is why this is different. That is why the comparison to Truss, a prime minister undone in 45 days, carries more weight than the Blair comparison. The question is not whether this premiership can be saved. The question that is now being asked, in private, by people who supported him, is simply about timing and management of the transition. I want to speak to you plainly about something that I think sits underneath all of this. Something that is true regardless of your politics, regardless of how you voted in 2024. What is happening right now is the consequence of a political culture that has learned to treat the act of governing as fundamentally a communications challenge, where the metric of success is not what has been delivered, but how well the gap between what was promised and what was produced has been managed in the public conversation. Starmer is not uniquely guilty of this. It is the operating system of modern British politics across parties, across administrations, across decades. But he is its current exemplar. And the reckoning he is facing is not just personal or partisan. It is a reckoning for that entire approach to public life. The boats are not a communications problem. The NHS waiting list is not a communications problem. The fiscal position that his own treasury is managing quietly and carefully, while the public statement remains one of cautious optimism, that is not a communications problem. These are governing problems, and they require governing solutions. And the man currently in Downing Street has spent his entire political career developing communication solutions. That mismatch between the nature of the problems and the nature of the person is what makes this different. It is what makes it, in my view, unrecoverable. So where does that leave us? Where does it leave you? Not in despair. That is important to say clearly, because the honest account of failure is not the same as resignation to it. Britain has been in difficult positions before. We have had governments that lost their way and found it replaced by something better. We have had political moments where the gap between what was being offered and what was needed became so visible that it produced something genuinely new. That is what this moment can be if the people who are watching it clearly are willing to say what they see and demand something different. Not more management, not better communications. Actual governing by people who understand that the job is to deliver results for the families bearing the cost of failure, not to construct narratives that make the failure easier to absorb. The reckoning for Starmer has begun. The numbers confirm it. The tea room confirms it. The backbenchers who have gone quiet on the doorstep confirm it. And the fact that his own party's Scottish leader has said publicly what everyone is saying privately confirms it most clearly of all. There is no way back from this. The question now is what comes next. Subscribe. Stay with this channel. Because that question, what comes next, is the most important one in British politics right now. And this is where it gets answered honestly.